In conversation with Michael White, J.M. White did graduate study in phenomenology at Duquesne University and also an MA in philosophy from Vanderbilt. His poems, interviews, essays, and book reviews have appeared in Exquisite Corpse, Sewanee Review, Janus Head, Parabola, and a Mirror, as well as in Magazine and Journals in Canada, England, Italy, Japan, Romania, New Zealand, and India. He has 13 books in print, 6 of poetry, and 7 of prose. He has compiled and edited 5 posthumous works by William Gay. He is a dual-paying member of the underground, currently hiding out on the back roads of rural Tennessee. And on today's episode of Auto Interview, it's my utmost pleasure, joy and excitement to offer the show today, Michael White. How are you doing today, Michael?
I'm very happy to be here with you today.
I'm very excited, really, to have you on the show today. I haven't read through some of your works on Amazon and see some of the amazing things you've done. The people you've connected with so far, I find it to be quite great, quite honorable, and quite amazing, really, to sit and have this conversation with you. So thank you once again for accepting the invitation and coming up on the show.
I'm happy to be here.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, Michael, I would like us, first of all, to start today's conversation by asking you to tell us a bit about William Gay. Could you give us a brief history about him, his literature works, and legacy before he passed away, and how you guys connected together? Yeah, maybe?
William was a remarkable writer who passed away in 2012. He was raised in rural Tennessee and grew up in an extraordinarily rural environment and lived in poverty and was a self-educated writer. And
Mm,
he went on to publish 3 books, 3 novels, and 3 collections of short stories while I was alive. After he passed away, I became his literary executor and inherited his papers.
mm,
And we have brought out 4 additional novels and another collection of short stories. So
mm,
when William was in the 7th grade, one of his teachers noticed that he was reading all the time and that he was reading the popular literature of the day, like Earl Stanley Garner and Mickey Spillane.
wow.
And the teacher told him, "You are all width and no depth." And the next day, the teacher gave him a modern library edition of Thomas Wolfe's Look Homeward,
Uh,
Angel. William read it, and the guy said, "If you'll read this and tell me what you think, it's a young man's book. And if you promise to read it, I'll give it to you. And
mm,
it's worth a box load of that junk you've been reading."
wow.
William took it home and he put the book on the table and he had a kerosene lamp. He lived in a house that was just a shack with no electricity and no running water.
Oh.
And he put the book on the table, and by the light of a kerosene lamp, he read in the introduction, and here's a quote: "This book was written in innocence and nakedness of spirit, and the writer's main concern was to give fullness, life, and intensity to the actions and people in the book he was creating. We are the sum of all the moments of our life, and every moment is a window on all time, and all that is ours is in every one. We
Mm,
cannot escape or conceal it. If the writer has used the clay of life, he has only used what all men must and what none can keep from using. Fiction is not fact, but
mm,
fiction is fact selected and understood. Fiction is fact arranged and charged with purpose. Remembering speechlessly, we seek that great forgotten language, the lost lane end into heaven, a stone, a leaf, an unfound door. Oh, lost and by the wind grieved ghost, come back again.
mm,
And when William read those words, it was an epiphany. It was like a lightning flash in the dead of night. And he felt an energy go through him, and it was just electrifying. And he knew in his bones it was his destiny to be a writer.
mm.
And he continued
Wow.
to read until his mother yelled at him to blow out the lamp. And excitement coursed through him, and he couldn't sleep, and he lay awake all night waiting for the first light so he could continue reading.
Wow.
And if it's possible a book can change your life, that book changed his. It sharpened
Wow.
everything around him and brought him into focus and pointed him towards a purpose. It set the
Mm,
direction of his life, and he never wavered. William knew from that moment he wanted to be a novelist, and to him it was the most exalted calling, the noblest thing you could do. He was stunned by the power of Wolf's language, and it was the first time he learned that you could make language do things that Wolf made it do. The
Mm.
book was intensely alive, and the characters walked and talked and lived their lives, and they would not abide the page. And the
Wow.
sense of utter October loneliness expressed in Wolf's prose stirred him in his depths. Wolf took the lives of ordinary people and made them transcendental. And
Wow.
William immediately set out to learn how to do it. That was his thought then, and years later, it never changed.
Mm.
Wolf's novel raised a curtain on the power of the word, and it articulated his compulsion to write and made it possible for him to believe that the stuff of life could, by some strange alchemy, be translated to the page.
Mm.
William was totally absorbed into Woolf's fiction, and he felt Woolf whispering to him in the night. And his Woolf's incantory rhetoric was like a hallucinating drug, and he was transfixed by the language. And it was the first time he realized language can transport you. It can take you outside yourself and can
Mm.
mean far more than any individual words. And
Wow.
suddenly the words like a stone, a leaf, or an unfound door took on a meaning he didn't know could exist. He read the book twice and gave and told the teacher about it, and that was the beginning of his career as a writer.
Wow.
He was born to write, and that was his whole life. And he started writing, and he wrote his first book when he was 25 years old.
Oh.
And he continued to write all his life and didn't get published until he was 58 years old.
Wow.
He wrote and submitted all that time, and he lived his life to write
Wow.
and would not do anything else. It drove his family a little bit crazy. Four kids, and he would take day jobs and work until the bills were all paid, and then he would quit and write.
Wow.
And then he would write and write and write until the bills piled up, and then he would take another job, work in a factory or work on construction, do something until he paid off all the bills. And once the bills were paid, he'd quit and
Go
sit and
back
write.
again and write. Wow.
He was dedicated to his writing, and he lived in a writer's trance. And
Mm.
whenever he was working or whatever he was doing, he was thinking about what he had to do in his work. And
Yeah.
he was plotting out his novels, plotting out the short stories he was writing. And then when he got home at night, he would take a chair and go out and sit by the edge of the woods and write the things that he had thought up during the day.
Oh, wow.
And there's a little passage in one of his books called The Lost Country where
Oh.
he describes kind of what it feels like to be in a writer's trance and what he was doing. He was a very shy person, and he didn't like being around a crowd of people. Whenever he was around people, he was observing and watching very closely.
Mm.
And a Lost Country, he has a little passage where the main character in the book is named Edgewater, and Edgewater is the most biographical of all the characters in Williams' books.
Oh, wow.
So he says Edgewater has had a job. He's out working as a sharecropper,
Mm.
picking cotton by the Mississippi River. And he's living in a little shack. And he says, the day in abeyance, the troubled waters asleep, lapping by the bedposts, trying
Mm.
along, he felt at once a kinship and a distance. In his counterfeit sackcloth, his imitation ashes, this respite from the dumb show, the wary pageant where inept actors can never remember their lines,
Mm.
cannot improvise or even remember their motivation.
Wow.
Edgewater was the worst of them, the worst of the lot, easing
Wow.
through life like a sneak thief, an agent
Mm.
provocateur, taking things that no one will even be missed. A
Mm.
glance, a word, a memory, a moment that no one else notices. It might
Wow.
have been lost, save that I have salvaged it as raw material to build myself. What do you want me to be? I'll construct a self from all these plundered lives, a
Wow.
prison from the broken glass. I'll
Wow.
be you, but not quite. A distorted replica of what you see when you lean towards the mirror, when your reflection leans towards the glass, and I'll
Mm.
steal your shadow and reflection and warp it to my purpose and steal away under cover of darkness and move
Wow.
on unnoticed with only the spurious credentials of my blistered palms.
Wow.
So that was William. When you were around him, he was watching. watching you, and then you might appear in one of his stories, as a character. Some of your movements or some of your actions, or they might be incorporated in the characters that he was writing about. So
Wow.
everything he did was bent towards his writing and his literature.
That's quite an amazing one, really. That's quite huge. That's quite amazing. That's quite a lovely background into the posthumous works of William Gay. I love your extensive description of it. I love your talking. I love your deep explanation into his works and how you get into writing too. Sounds to be quite inspiring, even to me.
Yeah,
Now, aside from the posthumous works of William Gay, you were also friend with people like William Burroughs, Allen Ginsberg, and Gregory Corso back then in the 80s and 90s. And you wrote a book titled Naropa Janus about your time with them. As I found this amazing enough and curious at the same time, because most of these guys actually passed away, they are dead already. Could you tell us more about this journal and your time with these amazing fellows?
sure. Around 1980, I figured out that Allen Ginsberg was teaching every summer at a school in Colorado, and that he would be there for 30 days,
Yeah.
and that William Burroughs would come for 7 days. Well, I had been reading Jack Kerouac's novels, like On the Road and Dharma Bums.
Mm,
It really inspired me and stirred up my literary energy in a way that no other writer really had up to that point.
yeah.
And the same with William Burroughs. And I've read through all the works of William Burroughs. He wrote a great book called Naked Lunch. And
Mm,
then Allen Ginsberg had been a poet, and he had published a poem called How that
oh.
really broke a lot of ground. These guys had gotten together in the 50s and
Oh.
had become close friends and encouraged one another. And Kerouac wrote On the Road and published it in 57. Burroughs wrote Naked Lunch and published it in 59. And
Oh.
Ginsberg wrote Howl and published it in 56. So
Wow.
those books set the template for what was going to happen in the 60s.
Mm,
And they were the prototype, the paradigm for what for the counterculture explosion that took place in America and worldwide in the 60s and 70s. So I had been reading all these books, and by 1980, I figured out that Allen Ginsberg was teaching every summer at
wow.
this place in Colorado. Jack Kerouac had passed away in 1969,
Oh,
and
wow.
Allen called these summer schools the Jack Kerouac School of Disembodied Poetics. And he would invite poets and writers from the Beat Generation circle to
Mm,
come to Naropa and spend the summer with him. And when I figured that out, it drew me like a magnet. And so
wow.
I showed up and spent the next 10 summers there for a week or two every summer.
Mm,
I wasn't there to get credit. I wasn't there as a student. I mean, I signed up and I paid my dues, but it wasn't, I was there to get the literary inspiration from these writers.
mm,
And uh, and I got to be friends with them all. And
mm.
it was an amazing encounter. And it was like if you get a confluence of genius, if you take great, great minds, great writers, and these were three of the greatest, Kerouac, Burroughs, and Ginsberg, in American literature in the 60s and 70s and 80s,
Yeah.
and you bring them together and they work together, there's a confluence and it becomes like a vortex of energy, and
Yeah.
things just explode. And, we saw it in like fourth century BC Greece. We
Yeah.
had Plato, Socrates and Aristotle, three great geniuses that came together, and
Yeah.
all of the whole template of Western culture was laid out. Well, in the 50s, Kerouac, Ginsberg, and Burroughs came together, wrote their great books, and it became the template for the counterculture of the 60s and 70s and set the trend for literature in America
Mm,
and in some ways worldwide.
wow.
And it was a great, great pleasure to be around them. And you had to be really on your toes.
Mm,
These guys had worldwide fame, and they had people coming at them from all around, and they would not. They didn't want to put up with stupid questions. So if you want to hang out with him, and I did, you better be sharp and on your toes. And here's a little story about hanging out with William Burroughs.
Mm,
So uh, I had read through all of Burroughs's works, and Burroughs was considered the genius of the geniuses. You
mm.
had these three guys who were all genius level writers. They looked at Burroughs as
Wow.
the
The
genius that was
boss.
above them, yeah, the
Yeah,
boss,
yeah. Mm,
the big guy. And so he was, and I did too. I thought he was, and sort of his reputation was for a while the smartest man alive. And so I approached him after a reading. I had a copy of his book, Naked Lunch. So will you
mm,
sign this for me? And I said, I've read through all your books. I really enjoy your books. I'm a big
mm.
fan. Thank you for, bringing this stuff to us. I'm going to be around for a week. If there's a chance to talk, I'd love to talk. And he says, come on by tomorrow afternoon. And he gives me his apartment number. So the next day, I'm knocking on William Burroughs' door,
Wow.
and he opens the door. And he had a reputation for being austere and sort of standoffish. But in person, he was very friendly. Come on in, Michael, have a cup of tea. And we
Mm,
sat around the table, and I knew he had been involved in all sorts of experiments, psychic experiments with out of body things and experiments in altered consciousness and all of this kind of thing. And he wrote every day in a journal and kept
yeah.
his dreams. And so
Oh.
when he would wake up in the morning, he would write down all the dreams that came to him. And he advised me to do the same.
Mm.
And he said that up to 50% of the material in his books came from his dreams.
Oh, wow.
And I was able that summer, there was another guy who was writing a little magazine, and he came to Burroughs, and I was in the room, and he said, will you give me something to publish? And Burroughs said, okay, here's something. And it was a dream he had written down the day before. And
Wow.
so the guy had it and he showed it to me and I read it and it was just a little dream. Burroughs was walking along and all at once he came to a stream and there were some rocks in the stream and he walked across the rocks to the other side of the stream. Well, the next year, Burroughs published a book called The Place of Dead Roads. And
Wow.
in that book, his character, Kim, was the main character. And I was reading along, and all at once, Kim was walking along, and he comes to a
Mm.
creek, and there's some rocks there, and he walks across on the rocks across to the stream. Well, Burroughs
Wow.
had taken that dream and made his character do the things that happened in that dream. And so when you read Burroughs's works, it was like you entered a dream state. It
Mm.
was his dreams, and he incorporated his dreams into the writing of his novels.
Yeah.
And so we were sitting around, and I said, have you ever experienced out of body experience, anything like this? And he says, oh, yes, it happens all the time.
Mm.
That kind of shocked me because it didn't happen to me all the time. It didn't seem like. And I said, well, what do you mean? I mean, other than the dream state? And he said, yes. Where were you yesterday at this time? And I shifted my eyes to the blank wall behind him, and my mind went through kind of like this little whirl. And bam, I saw myself in a classroom the day before, sitting there with this guy who was a Zen monk teaching a class.
Wow.
And I said, oh, yes, just like this. Oh, yes, I was with Philip Whalen yesterday at this time. And
Wow.
Bruce said, you were out of your body right then. That was an out of body experience. And
Yeah.
damn, I
Out of
realized.
body experience.
So that expanded my awareness right there on the spot.
Mm.
So being around those guys was really incredible.
Wow.
And the whole contingent of beat characters came through in the 80s. Ken Kesey was there.
Wow.
There was a guy there named Harry Smith, who was the most incredible of them all.
Mm.
And Alan told me that Harry was famous to the famous, but
Wow.
unknown to everyone else. And I got to know Harry, and I would go to Harry's apartment, and Harry had a log in his living room, and that was his
Mm.
couch. And he had a boulder, a small boulder, and that was his chair. Uh, and he had collections of stuff all around the room. And he had done the Anthology of American Folk Music and was
Oh.
an extremely famous filmmaker. But he was
Wow.
totally avant-garde and only known to the top flight artists of his day
Yeah.
and unknown to the public at large. But
Oh,
those were the kind of characters who were coming around Naropa. And
wow.
it was a fabulous experience and a training ground for being writers.
That's very lovely. Quite great. Quite
Yeah,
impressive to know. I love your deep answers to these questions. They're quite explanatory, quite didactic, quite introspective, and well, beautiful, lovely stories you've got of these people. Thank you so much for sharing. And
sure.
also, Michael, you have just finished an essay about the poetry of the Catholic mystic and poet Thomas Martin, and it is a critic of modern poetry in America and the relationship of poetry and the art to mysticism. Could you tell us about this as well?
So, Thomas Merton was a Trappist monk who lived in a monastery in Kentucky.
Mm,
And the monastery is about 3 hours north of where I have a home in Tennessee
yeah.
and a place in Florida, and I'm back and forth. And it's about 3 hours north of my home in Tennessee.
Mm,
And so when Merton passed away in 69, but he wrote voluminous poetry and prose and was extremely influential as a contemplative thinker
mm,
and writer. And he said that the artist and the poet are mystics turned inside out,
mm,
and that the mystic is looking for the essence of awareness. You know,
mm.
what is it that binds us all together?
Yeah.
What is that human nature and that nature that we share in common
Mm,
with all other people, with all other life, with all things in the world, you know. How do
yeah.
we how do we go from this individual self that we have to that experience of our common nature? And
Absolutely.
if you can move from your individual self to your common nature,
Mm,
that's how he defined the mystical experience.
yeah.
And and he says the artist, so when an artist paints a picture, let's say an artist has a flower in front of them and they paint a picture of the flower,
Mm,
when we look at that flower, if that conveys something of the suchness of the flower, of the essence of the flower, not just that individual flower, but the flowerness, you know, what it is that makes a flower, that's what makes it beautiful.
wow.
And and that is the suchness of it. And if the artist can convey that suchness to us, then we
Yeah.
have aesthetic experience of beauty.
Mm,
And at the same time, that feeling that carries you to that uh, place of uh, the essence of something moves you from your own individuality into the suchness of yourself, of your,
yeah.
each of us have that suchness of the human nature in
Very
us.
true.
And when
Yeah.
we see art or experience great literature, it brings out the suchness of the thing that's being portrayed in the literature.
Yeah.
And that is a driver that carries us
Big driver.
intuitively into our own suchness, away from
Mm,
our individuality into that human nature.
yeah.
So that's what Thomas Merton portrayed as the role of the artist and the poet, as well as the role of the monk or the contemplative or the mystic.
Mm. Oh, wow. That's quite amazing, really. I love your take on that, really. These are beautiful, lovely answers you've got in there. And now,
Yeah.
as a poet, I would like to ask you, how would you describe poetry? What does it mean to you? Because I feel like with different poets, poetry definition differs from person to person, depending. I have my own definition of poetry, and I've got so many other authors define poetry in a lovely manner that suits their needs, that suits their writing. I would love to hear from you, Michael. How would you define poetry? What does it mean to you?
Well, poetry is along this same line. It's the distilled essence of language
Mm,
poured into the cup of silence. So poetry is the language of the heart that speaks to all people. You
mm,
know, it doesn't matter whether you're African or Asian or
Yeah.
Native American or
Yeah.
European or American.
Mm.
Uh, poetry reaches into language and gets to that essential part of language and gives voice to the essence of language.
I love your divination. I love that. It stylishly resonates with my own divination that I've nurtured for a long time ago. I love to consider it the language of the soul of the writer or the language of the soul of the poet. Now, I have a clause to it. I'm not just stopping there as that being the only definition of poetry. I have a clause to it. You will like to hear the clause, right? I'm going to say it again.
Okay.
Poetry is a language of the soul of the poet. Now, the crux to this is at that particular time that a poem was written. So, in total, poetry to me is a language of the soul of the poet at that particular time that a poem was written. Why I love to add that clause of at that particular time that a poem was written is the fact that the poem for today or for a certain time may communicate heartbrokenness, may communicate joy, may communicate grief, may communicate pain, may communicate lamentation, may communicate this, that, etc. That's why I love to put the clause of at that particular time that the poem is written, because the poem or the poet could write something today and it's touch on the themes of grief or touch on the themes of pain. That was a particular time that the poem was written. That was a language of the heart of the poet. And some other time, it might communicate at brokenness, relationship issue, trust issue, etc. So that's why I love to add the clause of at that particular time that the
Yeah.
poem is written. Poetry is a language of the soul of the writer. I hope you enjoy that.
That's right, and that touches the very same point. That's the soul of the writer is that essence inside us. And if you can express that, uh,
Absolutely.
then you're a poet, you're an artist, you're a writer.
I enjoyed this conversation really. Thank you for sharing all of this. Looks quite great to me. And also, Mike, along with a biography of William Gay, you have written a biography of a Tibetan Buddhist master named Kenshan Pardon Sherab, Glorious Wisdom, and a second one on the teacher and translator Kate Doma, Pulling a Torch from the Sky. You've also been working on the biography of a Taos Pueblo artist and writer named Bernardi Track, and have visited the Zuni Opi and Taos Pueblos and attended the Kishinka Dance and Festival. And I must say that's quite a lot, really. But then I'd like to ask you, could you tell us more about this as encapsulated in your book titled Pulling Down the Sun?
Well, that's a lot to cover. Let's see.
That's really a lot to cover.
Yeah, this
Glorious
my
wisdom.
book about Paul Sherab. He is the
Oh,
Tibetan master, and it's called Glorious Wisdom.
wow.
And Paul Sherab was in the last generation of Tibetan teachers who were educated in the old school of Tibet. People generally know about the Dalai Lama and some of the information about it, but in the 1950s, the Chinese invaded Tibet, just
Oh,
like the Russians have invaded Ukraine now.
yeah,
The
yeah.
Chinese invaded Tibet, totally unprovoked. They just wanted to take over. And they invaded Tibet and swept into the country with a huge army.
Mm,
Tibet was an isolated country that didn't have diplomatic relationships with many other countries.
mm.
And Tibet was dedicated to Buddhist meditation and study.
Yeah.
And there were over 6,000 monasteries in Tibet.
Mm.
And Khenpo Palden Sherab was a student in one of those monasteries uh,
Oh.
as the invasion was happening. And he just completed his education in the monastic system of Old Tibet when the Chinese swept through and destroyed his monastery.
Mm,
And if you were a Buddhist monk when the Chinese came through, you had three choices. You could either uh, agree with the Chinese and give up your Buddhist practices,
Yeah.
you could go into exile or you could be killed.
Oh, wow.
So he went into exile. He and his family uh, put together an escape plan. It took them 18 months traveling across the Himalaya mountains, but they eventually made their way into northern India
Mm,
and lived in the refugee camps in northern India where the Dalai Lama lived.
wow.
And and then in the 1980s, he was invited to America, where
Mm.
he became the assistant to the head of one of the orders of Tibetan Buddhism.
Oh,
And
wow.
he was the representative of that man, one of the representatives in America. I contacted him and got to know him and invited him to come to Tennessee, and we built a temple.
Mm.
And there's a
Wow.
beautiful little temple in the rural hills of Tennessee dedicated to Tibetan Buddhist meditation. And
Wow.
he would come 2 or 3 times a year. And when I had him with me, he didn't speak English, but he had a younger brother who spoke English, and I
Wow.
got to drive him around. And as I would drive them around, I would say, "Tell me your life story." And I had a tape recorder, and the younger brother would hold the tape recorder, and Kempo Paulden would be in the back seat of the car, and he would speak in Tibetan and tell his life story. And his
Wow.
brother would speak it in English into the tape recorder.
Wow.
And I would take the tapes home and we would transcribe the tapes. And I wrote his autobiography,
Wow.
which carried him up to the age of 25.
Oh.
And then, unfortunately, he had passed away before we could finish the story.
Oh.
I finished the story then. I told the story from age 25 up till his passing. And
Mm.
that's what the book Glorious Wisdom is. The first half of the book is his account of his life in Old Tibet, being
Wow.
educated in the monasteries of Tibet. And the second half is my account of his life um, from about age 25 up to the time he
Mm.
passed away.
Oh, wow. That sounds like a lot, really.
Yeah.
That sounds like a lot. That's an amazing one. Thank you for
So,
sharing. Thank you.
um, so on the Native American front,
Yeah, please show a cover of it.
here is a copy of
Boy.
Pulling Down the Sun. And this is my account. Uh, Indigenous cultures around the world have fascinated me,
Yeah.
and the prehistory of the world and the tribal and indigenous peoples from all around the world, and I consider Tibet sort of an indigenous culture,
Yeah.
but we're highly influenced by Buddhism. But I was also interested in the Native Americans
Mm.
and the tribal people here in America, and I felt like we as Americans had done the same thing to them that the Chinese did to the Tibetans. We
Wow.
invaded the country, we took their land, stole their land,
Mm.
and then we really placed them on little small reservations
Mm.
on land that we considered worthless.
Wow.
And and so I was fascinated by the Native Americans all my life. And
Wow.
I wanted to make contact with Native American cultures, and I figured out that the Pueblo Indians of New Mexico in the
Mm.
American Southwest had maintained their culture in a more intact way than a lot of the other Native Americans.
Mm.
The Native Americans in the eastern half of the United States had been forced west of the Mississippi River in 1838 and
Oh.
put on small little reservations, mostly in the state of Oklahoma.
Wow.
And the reason for that is kind of, it was a ploy. The Americans would come in and say, "Who owns this land?"
Mm.
And the Indians would say, "We've lived here for generations." And the Americans would say, "You don't have title. You don't
Wow.
have, show me the title to this land." Nobody had title to the land, you know. And they would say, "Okay, we're taking your land." And they
Wow.
would force them onto a reservation in the deserts of the Southwest. But
Wow.
the Pueblo Indians in Arizona and New Mexico had already encountered the Spanish culture before the Americans got there, and the
Oh.
Spanish gave them land grants. And
Wow.
so when the Americans took over, and it was about 1840, the American culture came in and they said, "Who owns this land? Where's the title to the land?" The Pueblo Indians held up a land grant from the Spanish government. and said, "We
Wow.
own this land."
Wow.
And the
Wow.
American government miraculously accepted that,
Wow.
mostly because these Indians were living on desert land that the American government didn't care about. And
Hmm.
so these Indians never got relocated. They weren't forced off of their land onto a reservation somewhere else. They
Oh,
were able to live on their own land.
wow.
And there are 19 pueblos in New Mexico and Arizona. And one of my areas of study and one of my missions has been to go around to all of these different 19 pueblos and make
Wow.
contact with them. And
Oh.
there's one of them called Zuni, and the Zuni Indians are one of the most remarkable and intact Native American cultures in America.
Wow.
Called an annual series of festivals and dances, and they call them Kachina dances. And the Kachinas are the gods of the Zuni people. And the
Mm,
gods come to town, and they
wow.
have these big masks and costumes, and
Mm,
there's like 150 or 200 different Kachinas. And at these different festivals and events, people are designated and trained to become that god. And when you put
mm,
that mask on, you become that god.
wow.
And there's a place outside of town where they go and they dress and they put these costumes on and they come
Mm,
to town. And my wife and I have gone there many times and watched them come into town. And here comes 100 or 150 of these Indians dressed up in these fabulous costumes, some of them 8 and 10 feet tall, big
wow.
masks. And
Wow.
then with them are a group of elders, and the elders have drums and what they call bull roarers, which is a stick on a string. And they whip that stick around and it goes,
Wow.
and they're beating the drum, and this thing is going, and they're chanting in Zuni. And here comes 150 men dressed in these costumes, and it's the gods coming to town. And the
Mm,
gods come to town and they visit some of the houses in town, which are prepared for them, and they
mm,
dance all night.
wow.
And we have attended these dances. And when the gods come to town, Zuni just explodes with energy. It's like
Mm,
nothing I've ever experienced in my life.
wow.
It's history, it's legend, it's theater, it's dance, it's poetry, it's performance, it's music, and it's religion and mythology, and it's all put into one big package. And like, it's
Mm,
amazing theater, and it's like the birth of theater. This is what
wow.
in ancient culture, what theater meant
Mm,
when theater represented the myth and legend of the people and the poetry of the people and the literature of the people
wow.
and the religion of the people and the spirit of the people.
Wow.
And the Kachinas represent like the sky, the
Mm,
rain, the clouds, the
wow.
rivers, the mountains, the streams. You know? And so these things, like we say, the essence of things, each of the Kachinas represents the essence of some of the natural forces of life.
This is amazing, really.
Yeah.
I can go on and on and on and on and on and on. You've got an amazing, lovely illustration, beautiful answers to these questions that I find to be very great and quite pulling. And just apart from the books we've mentioned so far, do you have any other works you've authored or say currently working on? And also, where can interested viewers get some copies of your books?
Well, works in progress right now are one of those writers in the 80s was a guy named Gregory Corso.
Yeah.
And he's a internationally known poet. It was like Burroughs, Ginsberg, and Kerouac were the three big names. The next
Oh.
guy in line was Gregory Corso.
Oh.
And I got to be friends with Gregory, which was quite a endeavor,
Oh.
because he was a very tough guy
Wow.
and really put up with no nonsense and sort of had a theater about him. And I bought one of his journals one year.
Yeah.
I was at a party at Naropa, and I
Wow.
saw Gregory Corso across the room, and and he was going like this. And I didn't know him very well at the time. And I looked
Uh,
over my shoulder. I thought he's got to be pointing at somebody else. Why he wouldn't be pointing at me? Why would he be pointing at me? And I looked back at him, and he was going.
wow.
And so I went over to him, and he said, "Come with me, come with me." And so we went to his apartment, and he took me up to his room, and he had a duffel bag, and he had just come from Italy, and he had
Mm.
spent the last 6 months in Italy, and he had this duffel bag, and
Platforms.
my books are hard to find, uh, but they are available on Amazon. But you have to really be able to dig around on Amazon. I'm kind of an underground figure, and I don't publicize or market hardly at all,
Oh,
and I seldom appear. So I appear when I'm asked, but I don't get asked a whole lot, and I'm happy to appear, but I don't make much of a public face. So, but if you look under J.M. White, I publish under J.M. White, and you can put down the title of my book. They will pop up on Amazon, and there's 6 books of prose and
wow.
7 books of poetry there.
Interesting.
So, whenever we're ready to wrap it up, I'd like to wrap it up with a poem.
Yeah, yeah, that would be great, really. Yeah, let's wrap it up with a poem, yeah? Then I'll
Okay,
wrap it up over there. Yeah.
are we ready?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So this goes: Make your peace with the universe. No need to be afraid or despair.
Hmm.
Bow to the laws of the universe, not to those of the state. The
Hmm.
million formed, never motionless flame of life affords all you need. Some find comfort in denominations and creeds. The morning sun rising in the dawn is glory enough for me.
Hmm.
There's a great sea of energy out of which all things arise and dissolve. And when this life ends, as it must, the matter of this body will never be lost. Ever changing and ever moving, it will be part and parcel of this world. And
Hmm.
when Father Son explodes and consumes this earth, this substance will carry on in a cosmic dance. I
Hmm.
am one with the infinite and need no other assurance.
Hmm. Oh, wow. That's so beautiful. Do you have another one you would love to recite?
Oh, that was it.
That's a beautiful one. I love it. I'm intrigued. I'd love to hear more. Let's do one more if you have one more, please.
Okay,
That
sure. I
was
got
very evocative and very instructive. Sounds quite, it's powerful and it sounds philosophical in nature. It's deep.
so this one goes: Poetry is the secret language of the human heart.
Mm,
The market recognizes it not. It refuses to be commercialized. The world provides no stipend for poetry. Poetry does
mm,
not teach morality or good manners, just the opposite. It accepts no authority and pledges no allegiance.
mm.
Poetry goes against the grain and seems like foolishness to those caught
Wow.
in society's web.
Wow,
And
that's an amazing one, Michael. And I need to say that I've enjoyed this conversation extremely thoroughly. Yeah, I love it wholeheartedly. It's quite beautiful and very great. And for the sake of viewers who are watching, I left a link in the description part of this interview where interested viewers can get a copy of J.M. White's book directly on Amazon. I also left a link to his social media pages for possible followings. So thank you so much, Michael. I must say that this is such an amazing, lovely, beautiful, educative interview with you around your books, your writing, your literature journey. It's lovely, amazing, and awesome having you talk about it on the show. Thank you so much for coming on.
thank you for inviting me, Peter. It's been a joy to talk with you.
Yeah, it's my pleasure as well.